January 14th of 1975, Ricardo Lopez was born into a middle-class family in Uruguay. Ricardo's life may have begun in South America, but his family soon moved to the United States, settling in the state of Georgia when he was still a child. Ricardo had a good upbringing and was relatively well-behaved, but he was also described as introverted, with few friends at school or at home. As he grew into a teenager, Ricardo dreamed of a career in the arts and made the brave decision to drop out of high school in order to give himself a head start. However, soon after taking the plunge, Ricardo's bravado seemed to run dry. He suffered from feelings of inadequacy and was so terrified of rejection that he avoided applying to art school entirely. To support himself, Ricardo worked on and off at his brother's pest control business, and by age 17, he had not only become cripplingly reclusive, but he had developed a rather unhealthy obsession with celebrities. In 1993, Ricardo discovered an Icelandic singer by the name of Björk. Björk's first adult solo album was released in June 1993 to positive reviews and was subsequently named Album of the Year by the New Musical Express. Quickly earning platinum status in the US, her debut catapulted Björk to stardom. Her song, Venus as a Boy, was featured in the cult film Leon the Professional, adding a hint of floaty levity to a dark and violent narrative. Tens of thousands of Americans were captivated by Björk's ethereal pop music and hypnotic appearance, Ricardo included. But unlike his peers, whose interests in Björk began and ended with her music, Ricardo wanted to know everything there was to know about his favorite new artist. Ricardo began researching her early life and career, writing her numerous fan letters as he did so. These letters told Björk that she was his muse, and that his growing obsession provided him with an almost euphoric sensation. During this time, Ricardo also kept a journal, one in which he detailed his all-consuming infatuation. His writings reveal an ever-widening gyre between himself and reality, as he seemed certain that he would soon be accepted by Björk as a friend and mentor, or as Ricardo phrased it, someone who had an effect on her life. Ricardo also fantasized about creating a time machine, then using it to travel back to the 1970s where he would make friends with a childhood version of Björk. That way, he would secure himself as an indispensable figure in her life. Ricardo also seemed disturbingly confused over the nature of his feelings for Björk, and wrote in one diary entry that he couldn't make love to her because he loved her so much. By the time Ricardo was finished with the journal, it was a jaw-dropping 803 pages, with entire tracts of it detailing his lack of self-worth, how he was a loser who never even learned to drive. In total, the journal contains more than 160 references to himself as a failure, 34 references to taking his own life, and 14 references to murder. Compare those numbers to 408 mentions of Björk, and you start to get an idea of just how fixated Ricardo really was. By 1996, Ricardo was living in Hollywood, Florida, renting a small apartment while struggling to find work. It was around this time that he read an Entertainment Weekly article which detailed Björk's budding relationship with a London-based DJ named Goldie. Upon learning of this, Ricardo flew into a rage, consumed by feelings of jealousy, anger, and betrayal. "I wasted 8 months on her, and she has an effing lover?" he wrote in his diary, making several racist remarks in the process. Ricardo seemed irate that Björk was romantically involved with an Afro-Caribbean man, and began thinking of ways to punish her for embarking on an interracial relationship. This is around the same time that Ricardo ceased working on a handwritten diary and began to film a series of video diaries in his apartment. In one such video, Ricardo states that the purposes of the recordings was to document my life, my art, and my plan. "Comfort is what I seek in speaking to you. I am being my own psychologist. You are a camera. I am Ricardo." Over the course of the next few months, Ricardo filled 11 VHS tapes with his unhinged rants, totaling 22 hours of video diaries. He made references to his feelings for Björk as the crush that ended up as an obsession, and recorded himself planning and preparing what he referred to as his revenge. In one video, Ricardo seems to be arguing with himself over Björk's potential fate, and it's extremely disturbing to see his thought process end with, "I'm just gonna have to kill her. I'm gonna send her a package which, in turn, is going to send her to hell." It should be noted that in most incidents of stalker-related violence, the perpetrator has most commonly used a blade or firearm as their weapon of choice, whereas in Ricardo's case, his proposed methods were much more chillingly creative. For example, he brainstormed an idea that involved filling an explosive device with hypodermic needles containing HIV-infected blood. When he realized such a device was untenable, Ricardo switched the design up slightly, replacing the tainted blood with none other than sulfuric acid. The design consisted of a hollowed-out book, one which would spray Björk with the acid when she attempted to open it. The final stage of Ricardo's plan was to take his own life once he's received news of his attack's success. That way, he and Björk would be united in the afterlife, where they would remain together for all eternity. September 12th of 1996 saw the final entry into Ricardo's video diary. He titled the entry, "Last Day, Ricardo Lopez," and it begins with a visit to a local post office. Ricardo has the book bomb in his possession and documents his attempt to mail it, stating that he's very, very nervous, and that if he arouses any suspicion, he'll take his own life rather than face arrest. The video cuts out just as Ricardo walks into the post office and only resumes once he's returned home. Björk's music plays in the background as a naked Ricardo shaves his head and paints his face red and green. He then appears to examine himself in a mirror for a short time before turning towards the camera and saying, "I'm a little nervous now." Ricardo went on to state that he was definitely not drunk or depressed, and that he knew exactly what he was doing. "The gun is cocked back," he's heard saying, adding that it's ready to roll. As the Björk song "I Remember You" reaches its conclusion, Ricardo becomes increasingly and visibly nervous. He glances at the gun, then at the camera, then back at the gun, and it becomes obvious that he's beginning to tremble and hyperventilate. Then, as he finishes, Ricardo looks angrily into the camera, screaming, "This is for you," then takes his own life. He is briefly heard groaning, and the viewer can make out a hand-painted sign in the background which reads, "The Best of Me, September 12." Forensic investigators later theorized that Ricardo had intended to spray the sign with his own blood and brains, almost like it was his final piece of art, his masterpiece. It wasn't until September 16th that Ricardo's neighbors smelled a foul odor coming from his apartment. Officers from the Hollywood Police Department quickly broke in, discovering Ricardo's rotting, bloated corpse in the process. Written on the wall was a short message, one which read, "The 8mm videos are documentation of a crime, and they're for the FBI." Police were forced to evacuate the apartment block while the city's bomb squad cleared the place of explosives. Only then were they able to watch the tapes to uncover Ricardo's sinister and deadly plans. The cops then rushed to contact London's Scotland Yard, warning them that the potentially explosive package was en route to Björk's residence in Chelsea. Thankfully, the package had yet to be delivered, and the Metropolitan Police were able to intercept it from a South London post office. In reality, there was little danger of Björk's receiving the package, as her mail was vetted through her management's office. And in an ironic twist of fate, it turned out that Björk and Goldie had actually broken up just a few days before Ricardo took his own life. Once she learned of Ricardo's actions, Björk released a public statement in which she professed how distressed she was by the incident. Calling it very sad and terrible, she warned that people should not take me too literally or get involved in my personal life. However, she did have the grace to send a letter of condolence to Ricardo's family, stating that she was very upset that somebody had died, couldn't sleep for a week, and I'd be lying if I said it didn't scare the F out of me. I could get hurt, and most of all, my son could get hurt, and that terrifies me. Ricardo's family and friends later responded by saying that although they were aware of his obsession with her, They had no idea he would actually resort to violence. A psychiatrist who treated Lopez for anxiety shortly before his death also stated that he did not appear dangerous. Maybe that's what's so insidious about a case like Ricardo's. What ended up as a murderous rage appeared to observers as nothing but a harmless infatuation. Ricardo was most definitely insane, but unlike so many others, he was able to hide the extent of his madness from those around him. He had one face for the public, and one face for the camera, and maybe the last image of him, gun in his mouth with a red and green face, actually gives us an idea of how Ricardo really felt about himself, not on the outside, but on the inside. So, without being too specific, I live in a very hot, very sunny place, and a few years back, I lived in an apartment that had some amazing natural light. Only trouble was, I had to close my blinds for the hottest part of the day, or the sun would basically bleach anything it touched over time. That was kind of annoying, but it was all in the residents' association contract, so I was pretty much legally bound to plunge my apartment into darkness on the daily during summertime. Not that I had a problem with that after a while, though, because one day I started to notice that a dude in the apartment building opposite me would always come out onto his balcony and, stare at me. I'd have done something about it earlier, maybe gone over and asked him nicely not to do it, but he was an older guy and I think he was just past the point of caring. Irritating, but harmless, or so I thought. Because one day, I come home from work to find my blinds open. I never ever forget to close them before I left in the morning. Ever. Last thing I wanted was to lose my security deposit, which are very, very high where I live as the government owns basically all the rentable residential units. I'm not an overly paranoid person, so I just figured it was the one time I've forgotten to close them. Only as I walk over, I see the older dude sitting on his balcony, looking down at me, and he's smiling. I know it was him. I don't have proof, but I know he got into my apartment somehow. There was just something about that smile, something that said, "You can't hide from me." For a while I thought he might have gotten the building's maintenance guy to open them or something, or the cleaners. They serviced apartments, and might have forgotten to close the blinds after spending time in my apartment. Naturally, my first action was to contact the building's management and told them I thought there might have been a break-in. Obviously, they were very open to investigate this and told me that they'd have the security team review the security camera footage from my block to identify if someone broke in. When they came back and told me that no one had been in my room that day but me, I had to make a tough decision. I could stay at the apartments and put myself at potential risk, or I could buy out the rest of my lease and just get out of there. This is what had me second-guessing myself, as a few $1,000 wasn't a loss I was willing to easily swallow. But then all it took was waking up one day, walking over to my window, and seeing that guy smiling down at me again. Smiles are weird like that. Sometimes can be like a ray of sunshine, but that guy's smile made my skin crawl. Some things in life you just don't risk, and whether it was that old dude or something else I hadn't figured out, I just wasn't willing to find out the hard way. John Warnock Hinckley Jr. was born in Ardmore, Oklahoma on May 29th of 1955. At the age of 4, his financially fortuitous family relocated to Dallas County, Texas, where his father was the chairman and president of the Vanderbilt Energy Corporation. John would go on to attend Highland Park High School, graduating in 1973, just in time for another relocation in Evergreen, Colorado. In 1974, he enrolled at Texas Tech University, but the advent of serious emotional problems meant he would abandon his degree in favor of more creative pursuits. By 1975, John had become disillusioned with higher education and dreamed of becoming a singer-songwriter. He moved to Los Angeles but found the pursuit of stardom to be as depressing as it was fruitless. He often wrote to his parents, begging for money while he detailed his life with girlfriend Lynn. Little did they know, Lynn was a complete fabrication, someone John had made up so he didn't feel like such a failure. John finally threw in the towel in September of 1976, returning to his parents' place in Colorado under a dark cloud of disillusionment. He was prescribed antidepressants and tranquilizers to deal with his ever-increasing emotional problems, and his behavior was closely monitored by his parents and doctors. However, it seems his actions weren't scrutinized too closely, because by the late 70s, John had amassed a sizable collection of firearms and ammunition, all in the name of fulfilling a deeply thought-out plan. You see, round about the same time John moved back in with his parents, a certain Martin Scorsese film set movie theaters alight all over the world. Starring Robert De Niro, the movie was named Taxi Driver and told the story of a disturbed taxi driver who plots to assassinate a presidential candidate. Scorsese was heavily inspired by the story of Arthur Bremer, a man who had attempted to assassinate U.S. Democratic presidential candidate George Wallace in May of 1972. The attack left Wallace permanently paralyzed from the waist down, and the rage-bait media circus that followed had a profound effect on John Warnock Hickley Jr. If he wanted attention, if he wanted respect from a certain section of the American public, all he had to do was shoot a big name with a big gun. Watching Taxi Driver only reinforced this message for Hinckley, who began to see a lot of himself in the movie's protagonist. But there was another character in the film who Hinckley found equally magnetic, that of 12-year-old Iris Steensma. A 13-year-old Jodie Foster played the underage escort that became the object of the protagonist's affections, and just as the titular taxi driver became infatuated with the girl, Hinckley found himself drawn to Jodie Foster in much the same way. When John heard that Foster had enrolled at Yale University, he immediately relocated to Connecticut in order to be closer to her. From there, he stepped up his stalking efforts dramatically, bombarding Foster with love letters, poems, and phone calls. Obviously, Foster was extremely unhappy with the unwanted attention and opted to ignore John's communications entirely. But instead of taking the hint and moving on with his life, the silent rejection seems to have filled John with a deep and burning rage. He began to fantasize about hijacking an aircraft and crashing it in front of Foster in order to get her attention. When that plan grew too complex, John simplified his approach by plotting to take his own life in front of her. Yet all it took was another rewatch of Taxi Driver and John had his lightbulb moment. He would assassinate a sitting president, carving his name in the annals of history. Then, as John phrased it, he could appeal to her as an equal, not as a subordinate. John began tracking President Jimmy Carter around the country and was eventually arrested in Tennessee on a firearms offense. By this point, John was flat broke, having blown the last of his meager savings on travel expenses. He was forced to return home and took the opportunity to seek serious psychiatric counsel. Yet, despite a program of intensive mental health treatment, his condition failed to improve. John seems to have genuinely wanted to better himself at this stage. He understood that he was suffering from a rather severe personality disorder, and that if he was going to get anywhere in life, he would have to overcome these problems. Yet in 1981, the election of President Ronald Reagan saw all John's progress thrown by the wayside, and he once again became obsessed with the idea of assassinating a sitting president. For research, John began to study the murder of John F. Kennedy and wished to emulate the actions of Lee Harvey Oswald. Once his plan was formed and the date set, he wrote to Jodie Foster one last time. Quote, "Over the past 7 months, I've left you dozens of poems, letters, and love messages in the faint hope that you could develop an interest in me. Although we talked on the phone a couple of times, I never had the nerve to simply approach you and introduce myself. The reason I'm going ahead with this attempt now is because I cannot wait any longer to impress you." On March 28th of 1981, John took a bus to Washington, D.C. before checking into the Park Central Hotel. He'd given the assassination attempt a great deal of thought, and had rightly come to the conclusion that he might be killed while carrying it out. About 2 hours before his attempt, he wrote another letter to Jodie Foster, stating that he had hoped to impress her with the magnitude of his actions, and that he would abandon the idea of getting Reagan in a second if he could only win your heart and live out the rest of my life with you. Essentially, this was the most high-profile case of emotional blackmail in contemporary American history. On March 30th, the newly minted President Reagan delivered a luncheon address at the Washington Hilton. The hotel had been thoroughly secured by the Secret Service, who had run inspections and patrols more than 100 times before Reagan arrived. What's more, this particular branch of Hilton was considered the safest venue in the entire city due to a secure, enclosed entranceway known as the President's Walk, which was constructed following the assassination of JFK. Reagan entered the Hilton through the passageway at about 1:45 p.m. while wearing a bulletproof vest. No one saw Hinckley behaving in an odd manner, and it was later confirmed that witnesses who claimed Hinckley was fidgety and agitated had confused him with another individual that the Secret Service had been monitoring. At exactly 2:27 p.m., President Reagan exited the hotel through the same President's Walk, emerging on Florida Avenue to a gaggle of waiting journalists. He answered a few questions, then walked towards his limousine, which was flanked by a crowd of supporters. Secretly among these reporters was John Hinckley Jr. himself, who had somehow managed to slip past 2 layers of presidential security. As Reagan's supporters applauded him, he just so happened to pass directly in front of John's line of sight. Believing this was his golden opportunity, John assumed a crouching firing stance, then rapidly discharged a .22 revolver in Reagan's direction. All 6 bullets missed the president, but devastation was unleashed on those around him. The first bullet struck Press Secretary James Brady in the head, just above his left eye. The bullet then traveled underneath his brain, shattering his brain cavity in the process. Police officer Thomas Delahanty was then struck in the back of his neck by the second shot, with the bullet ricocheting off his spine. Alfred Antonucci, a labor official from Ohio, spotted Hinckley's firing the first 2 shots and rushed into action. He bashed John over the head and wrestled him to the ground, but otherwise failed to disarm him. As Reagan was rushed to the presidential limo by his Secret Service agents, a 3rd shot smashed the window of a building across the street. The 4th bullet was considerably more accurate, but the selflessness of Agent Tim McCarthy meant Reagan was saved from certain death, as McCarthy used himself as a human shield to absorb the bullet's impact. The hot piece of lead punched through his right lung and through his liver, with the 5th and 6th bullets hitting the bullet-resistant window glass of the limo's rear door. The 5th bullet bounced harmless off the glass, but the 6th took a nasty ricochet, deflecting off of the vehicle's frame before hitting the president in his left armpit. The round grazed a rib and lodged in his lung, causing it to partially collapse before stopping less than an inch from his heart. That's all that separated Ronald Reagan from death by assassination: 25 millimeters of his own blood and tissue. Naturally, John was arrested and detained, and walked away from the scene with nothing but cuts and bruises. A testament to the discipline of the Secret Service agents who protected him from a crowd that bayed for his blood. The day after the shooting, the 6-shooter John had used was traced to Rocky's pawn shop in Dallas, Texas. This was how the cops discovered that it had been loaded with 6 Devastator brand bullets, a specialized kind of ammunition designed to explode on contact. Luckily, the only bullet which properly exploded was the one which struck James Brady, yet doctors soon learned that the bullets still wedged inside the shooting victims could actually explode at any time. We can only imagine the tension in the operating rooms as volunteer doctors were wearing bulletproof vests remove the bullets from the victims' bodies. When Nancy Reagan arrived at the hospital her husband was being treated at, Reagan supposedly remarked to her, "Honey, I forgot to duck." Then, upon entering the operating room in a conscious state, Reagan removed his oxygen mask to quip, "I hope you're all Republicans." It was reported that the doctors and nurses laughed out loud at the president's remark, with Joseph Giordano, head of the medical team and a registered Democrat, replying with, "Today, Mr. President, we're all Republicans." At his trial in 1982, John was charged with 13 separate offenses, but was eventually found not guilty by reason of insanity. The attorney who represented John during his trial argued that his client suffered from a devastating form of schizophrenia, while another diagnosed Hinckley with narcissistic and schizoid personality disorders. He was quickly transferred into psychiatric care after stating that the shooting was the greatest love offering in the history of the world, before professing his disappointment that Jodie Foster hadn't reached out to him in the aftermath of the event. While confined to St. Elizabeth Hospital in Washington, D.C., John was treated for narcissistic and schizotypal personality disorder, as well as major depressive disorder. Tests revealed that he was an unpredictably dangerous man who might harm himself or any third party at the drop of a hat. In a 1983 Penthouse interview, John said his average day consisted of seeing a therapist, answer mail, play guitar, listen to music, play pool, watch television, eat lousy food, and take delicious medication. By 1987, John had applied for a court order allowing him periodic home visits, and as part of the consideration of the request, a judge ordered Hinckley's hospital room searched. To their horror, hospital staff discovered photographs and letters that showed that John's fixation with Jodie Foster hadn't been dampened in the least bit. Officials also uncovered evidence that John had exchanged letters with serial killer Ted Bundy, as well as seeking a mailing address for the incarcerated Charles Manson. Manson had apparently inspired Lynette "Squeaky" Fromm to attempt the assassination of President Gerald Ford, and it was speculated that John believed he and Fromm had enough in common to spark a romantic interest in her. In July of 2016, after years of legal battles, a federal judge ruled that John could be released from St. Elizabeth's on the grounds that he was no longer considered a threat to himself or others. Although he was released from the hospital, it was with many conditions. For example, he was required to live full-time at his mother's home in Virginia. He was forbidden from consuming alcohol, and he was forbidden from owning a firearm. Some of those are pretty standard for an early release, but the list also included some rather unusual stipulations. A great example of these is how John was forbidden from owning any memorabilia related to Jodie Foster. He was also told he wasn't allowed to visit the graves of past presidents and had to make solid records of his internet search history. Another rather strange condition of his early release was that John was forbidden from giving interviews to the press and from posting content online. Yet in late 2020, this ruling was quashed and John was free to, of all things, start his own YouTube channel. Listed under the name John Hinckley, the channel includes many original pieces of music penned by John himself. Some are called things like Love for Real and The Never-Ending Quest, and are generally lighthearted pieces of acoustic pop which belie the man's criminal history. Yet on occasion, it's impossible not to notice the cold, dead look in Hinckley's eyes, or to appreciate the irony of a man like him singing, "Can't we all just get along?" Because as long as there are people like him, men willing to murder each other in order to impress celebrities, the likelihood of us all getting along are very slim indeed. About 10 years ago, while she was still in college, my wife went on a date with a guy, probably the weirdest of her entire life. She didn't see him again, but the guy had other ideas, I guess, and basically began stalking her. It got worse and worse until she was forced to get a restraining order. But it turns out that those things have an expiration date on them. In one sense, that makes sense. People change, people better themselves. But at the same time, which part of obsessive psycho makes you think they're just going to let it go? Anyway, she ended up moving to my state for graduate school, and we got married after dating on and off for a couple of years. She told me about the guy one time, but it was more like a dark chapter in her former life, one that was well and truly over with. Or so we thought. The problem now is that my wife received a letter in the mail recently from the stalker that had her home address on it, one that included a return address on it too. He wants a reply, and if he doesn't get it, well, I don't want to think about that. The question is, what legal options, if any, do we have? We live in a different state than the stalker, hundreds of miles away, but I'm not looking forward to telling my wife that this psychopath knows where we live when she gets home from work today, as you can imagine. I don't really want to include the specific state we live in or much detail than I've already included because of the risk of the stalker reading this and using it against us somehow. I can't believe this is happening, and honestly, I'm terrified. She's talked the guy up to be this total schizo, and I've never been much of a fighter. I'm scared that we go down the legal route, spending all this time and money only for him to just show up on our doorstep one day with the worst of intentions. Born on July 25th of 1948, Richard Farley was the eldest child in a military family that frequently relocated. Richard spent the majority of his formative years in California, graduating from Santa Rosa Junior College before enlisting in the U.S. Navy in 1967. Following his discharge in 1977, Richard found a position as a software technician at the Electromagnetic Systems Laboratory, a defense contractor in Sunnyvale, California. For 6.5 years, Richard was a model employee. His military bearing had been a huge appeal to his potential employers, and for a long time, Richard proved himself a disciplined and diligent worker. Yet it seems Richard's veneer of stability was just that, nothing more than a well-practiced facade, and his mask only slipped when he was introduced to a young woman by the name of Laura Black. In April of 1984, the Electromagnetic Systems Laboratory welcomed 22-year-old Laura Black onto their team. Richard was 35 at the time, and the moment he laid eyes on Laura, he was smitten. He later said that it was love at first sight, how he was suddenly magnetized to her beauty, and in that moment, he swore he'd do anything to make her his. At first, Richard's advances were wholesome and respectful. He sent Laura a letter, along with a basket of homemade baked goods, inviting her out on a date with him. Laura later said she was flattered, but politely declined his offer, as Richard wasn't someone she was interested in dating. She'd hoped that Richard might take the rejection in his stride, but unfortunately, this proved to be painfully wishful thinking. One day, Laura received a call at her desk via the office's internal phone network. When she answered, she recognized the voice on the other end, but their demeanor was anything but professional. It was Richard, and he was demanding to know why she wouldn't go out with him. Laura firmly rebuked him, demanding that he leave her alone, and for a while it worked. But when Richard suddenly showed up at Laura's aerobics class, she realized she wasn't dealing with a well-adjusted person. After the aerobics ambush, Richard enacted a sinister scheme in which he provided false information to his employer's HR department. Through this, Richard was able to obtain Laura's address and phone number. Part 2 of his plan involved befriending the company's custodial department as a way to secure a copy of Laura's desk keys. This way, he could pore through her office desk in order to gain insights into her personal life. Laura found Richard's advances to be incredibly creepy, but every time she confronted him, he'd back off long enough for her to regain some semblance of comfort. Almost every time he retreated, she thought she'd ended the problem, but Richard's stalking always resumed, and always with an increasing gall and intensity. The final straw appeared to be when Richard began sending Laura doctored photos of her, photos that Richard had inserted images of himself into. They were mocked up to make the pair look like a loving couple, and the implications made Laura's skin crawl. Finally, after almost a full year of sporadic harassment, with Richard averaging at least 2 incidents of stalking a week, Laura approached the ESL Human Resources Department and begged them for help. After a brief investigation, the company took swift action, presenting Richard with an ultimatum. Either he sought counseling, or his employment would be terminated. Richard was furious at the humiliation, yet he conceded, attending the counseling sessions in order to maintain what little professional contact he had with Laura. He completed his course of counseling, but depressingly, Richard slowly began to commence his campaign of harassment, only this time, his malice was unmasked and unfettered. By the spring of 1986, Richard was unleashing torrents of verbal abuse on anyone who tried to interfere with his harassment of Laura Black. It was these outbursts, along with the decline in his performance, that led him to being fired by the Electromagnetic Systems Laboratory. However, he quickly found a similar position at a rival company that was also based in Sunnyvale, allowing him to continue stalking Laura in his spare time. This eventually led Laura Black to file a formal restraining order against Richard in February of 1988, one that was provisionally granted by a family court judge who sympathized with her 4-year-long plight. When Richard learned of the restraining order, he flew into a rage and began plotting to undermine the legal integrity of the restraining order. On February 9th of 1988, Richard dropped off a package at the office of Laura's attorney. The package contained doctored photographs, hotel and credit card receipts, and fabricated love letters, all designed to make Laura seem like she was lying about them having a prior relationship. While the contents of the package were decidedly false, it was voluminous enough to cast a great deal of doubt onto Laura's claims, and while she fought to have the restraining order ratified, this gave Richard time to put another one of his schemes into action. A complete restraining order might have prevented Richard from doing what he did next, but since he delayed its formal recognition, he was able to make a life-changing decision completely unimpeded. Richard began to stockpile weapons and ammunition, including a Mossberg shotgun barrel and a Ruger .22 LR carbine and over 3,000 rounds of ammunition. Then, on the day before the restraining order was due to be fully instituted, Richard Farley drove his motorhome into the Electromagnetic Systems Laboratory parking lot. He later confessed that the purpose of his visit was to talk Laura out of filing the restraining order and that if she refused, he would take his own life in front of her. Yet as grim as his plan was, it required more than one firearm, and a small one at that. So, the fact that Richard loaded his vehicle up with a 12-gauge semi-automatic shotgun, a .22 scoped rifle, a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun, and 4 smaller pistols speaks to much deadlier machinations. Richard wasn't preparing for a discussion. He was preparing to commit a massacre. On February 16th of 1988, when Richard climbed out of his motorhome, he wore a bulletproof vest, earplugs, and a single leather shooting glove. Stored in a variety of clips, magazines, and speed loaders, Richard had over 1,000 rounds of ammunition on his person and carried a pick and mix of his makeshift arsenal as he walked towards the ESL building. Then, out of nowhere, he raised his rifle and began firing at innocent bystanders. Security tried to lock Richard out of the building, but he simply shot his way through the glass front doors and continued to fire at will. His victims were mostly random, but his route was not. Richard was pushing through the ESL building, intent on visiting one office in particular, that of the 26-year-old Laura Black, the woman he'd been victimizing for the past 4 years. Laura had already heard the approaching gunfire and had been walking towards her office door as Richard arrived on the opposite side. The maniacal gunman thrust a boot into the Foxwood paneling, opening the door but inadvertently sending it smashing into Laura's head. She fell back onto the carpeted floor, ears ringing, barely conscious, and completely at the mercy of her dangerous, insane stalker. Richard stood there for a moment, eyeing his prostrate prey. Laura was 10 years younger than him and almost a foot shorter. She posed no threat to the man whatsoever. But still he raised his shotgun, and still he pulled the trigger. The shot sent steel pellets ripping into Laura's left shoulder, collapsing a lung in the process, but for some reason, Richard only fired once. It could have been that shooting Laura brought a certain gravity to the situation, making Richard realize what he was doing was an act of pure evil. But it's more likely that, by that point, Richard could hear police sirens and what had once been a feeling of utter wrath became one of abject terror. Within minutes, he'd be facing a SWAT team, and the best-case scenario involved spending the rest of his life in a cage. It's likely he panicked, allowing the wounded to crawl away and hide, and miraculously, this included his intended victim, Laura Black. The presence of police snipers caused Richard to unravel even further, and after the marksman cover gave Laura and the other survivors a window of escape, Richard surrendered after being offered nothing more than a sandwich and a soft drink. In total, 98 shots were fired, and 7 people were murdered during an attack that lasted more than 5 hours. At his multiple murder trial, Richard gave a full and frank confession to the killings, but shocked the court by pleading not guilty. Though a statement read out by his attorney, Richard stated that he didn't actually plan to kill anyone, and only wished to get Laura's attention. This was when he touched on his plan to take his own life in front of her if she happened to reject him for what could have easily have been the 100th time. Richard's defense attorney claimed that contrary to the evidence, his client was not a violent man. To quote, the attorney said his client only had his judgment temporarily clouded by his obsession with Black, and that he would likely never kill again. In clinical terms, this was partially supported by the fact that Richard lacked any kind of criminal record, but the jury was far too astute to be fooled by any kind of legal gymnastics. On top of that, the prosecution provided them with documentation from every step of Richard's stalking, producing almost every single letter he ever sent, along with the receipts from his weapon and ammo purchases. This evidence amounted to extensive premeditation and proved to be the final nail in Richard's judicial coffin. On October 21st of 1991, Richard Wade Farley was found guilty on all 7 counts of first-degree murder. A few months later, a Superior Court judge sentenced him to death. In line with California state law, several appeals were automatically lodged. This is one of the reasons why so many of California's death row prisoners have historically had their sentences reduced to life imprisonment. But even in a state so keen to show mercy on its condemned, 2009 saw California's Supreme Court uphold Richard's death sentence. To them, such a rare monster as he deserved nothing but execution. As of January 2022, Richard is still on San Quentin's death row, and due to execution moratorium instituted by Gavin Newsom, it's likely he'll remain there until he dies of natural causes. Laura Black, on the other hand, went on to completely recover from the attack, and despite suffering a great deal of mental trauma, she continued to work at the Electromagnetic Systems Laboratory. From his prison cell, Richard wrote Laura one last letter. Much like his previous communique, it was long, meandering, and incoherent, but the central theme was one of conceding victory, or as Richard phrased it, "You finally won." I believe this provides us with the most intimate and disturbing look into the man's psychology. He didn't see Laura as a person to woo or win over. He didn't want to win her trust or charm her into attraction. She was competition, a rival, someone he wanted to defeat, in order to own. In January of 1999, 21-year-old student Shiori Ino decided to visit an amusement arcade in her home city of Saitama. It was there she met a handsome young man by the name of Katsuhito Komatsu, who told her he was a 23-year-old entrepreneur who dealt in cars, real estate, and precious metals. The pair talked for a while before Katsuhito asked Shiori out on a date. She accepted, and soon the couple were seeing each other regularly. Not only that, but Katsuhito began showering Shiori with lavish gifts such as Louis Vuitton handbags and handmade Gucci dress clothes. There came a point where Shiori simply couldn't bring herself to accept such expensive offerings, but after politely declining one of his gifts, Katsuhito exploded into a rage. In front of hundreds of passerbys, he began screaming abuse at her, something which is considered highly unusual and disgraceful in Japanese culture. Naturally, Shiori was appalled by the outburst and swore off seeing Katsuhito again. A few days went by, then Shiori received a telephone call at her home address. It was Katsuhito calling to profess how apologetic he was concerning his recent tantrum. At first, it seems Shiori gave him the benefit of the doubt and agreed to continue dating him. There was just one little problem. Shiori had never given Katsuhito her home phone number, only her cell phones. So how did he end up getting his hands on it? The question didn't seem to bother Shiori too much, as she obviously agreed to carry on seeing Katsuhito. Yet, her faith in him was completely shattered when she found an old ID card down the back of one of his car seats. Not only had Katsuhito given her a false name, but he wasn't actually 23. He was closer to 27 years of age. And while it was the truth that he was an entrepreneur, it wasn't buying and selling gold and silver that made him his fortune. It was from running a series of seedy massage parlors around Saitama. It was the final straw for Shiori, only this time, when she tried to break it off with Katsuhito, he openly made threats to her life until she agreed to continue the affair. This terrified Shiori to the point that she actually wrote a last will and testament on March 30th of 1999. Around this time, she made another attempt to end the relationship, telling Katsuhito she'd rather die than continue the soul-crushing charade. But Katsuhito was as shrewd as he was malicious, and simply switched up his tactics to threaten her loved ones, essentially holding them hostage until she agreed to keep seeing him. Shiori continued dating Katsuhito for 3 months, and only did so to ensure her family's safety. However, come June 14th, it seems Shiori had simply had enough. She invited Katsuhito out to a local cafe, then read him the riot act. She made it clear that she was never going to see him again, and that no amount of intimidation would change her mind. It's possible she simply believed he was bluffing, and that he didn't have it in him to actually hurt people, especially innocents like her younger brother. In a sense, she was right, but Katsuhito's revenge would prove much more creative than she could have possibly imagined. The very same day Shiori delivered her final rejection, Katsuhito and 2 of his friends drove over to her parents' home. But instead of subjecting them to violence as he promised, Katsuhito confronted Shiori's parents with a series of fictional accusations. He accused them of being complicit in illegal activity that Shiori had instigated. Shiori's father stood firm in the face of Katsuhito's outbursts, telling him to take back the gifts he'd forced onto his daughter. Yet as soon as he mentioned this, Katsuhito and his 2 friends began to retreat, saying they didn't want the gifts back and Shiori was entitled to keep them. It was clearly an odd reaction, but it was by design. You see, Katsuhito wanted to make it look like he and Shiori not only had an on and off again relationship, but were also partners in crime. Yet Shiori had been ready for him and had recorded the entire exchange on a hidden dictaphone. It was all the evidence she needed that she was being subjected to a prolonged campaign of harassment. Yet when she presented the tape to officers at the Saitama police station, they did absolutely nothing. To them, she didn't have a case, and it was nothing more than a dispute between criminals. Following a series of harassment calls from someone calling themselves Tanaka, Shiori once again begged the local police for help. Yet to her family's horror, local law enforcement sided with Katsuhito, suggesting that Shiori was to blame for trying to end the relationship after accepting such expensive gifts. Yet despite their indifference, there was one officer who was well and truly outraged by the mishandling of the affair, and it was he who directed the Ino family to a free legal clinic run by the Saitama Chamber of Commerce. It was Shiori's last best hope, but after just 15 minutes of consultation, the attending attorney looked up from his legal pad and asked, "But she had a lot of stuff bought for her, right?" Faced with yet another male authority figure who refused to acknowledge Katsuhito's wrongdoing, the Ino family's collective hopes were dashed. On June 21st of 1999, Shiori took the drastic step of having every single one of Katsuhito's gifts returned via private courier service. Katsuhito demanded the courier turn back around and redeliver them to Shiori, but the courier had been given the explicit instruction and a generous tip to just dump the stuff before leaving. Katsuhito was absolutely livid, apoplectic to the point that it dwarfed all of his previous outbursts. This time, instead of taking steps to embarrass or browbeat Shiori, he decided on a much more permanent solution. Kazuhito approached an ex-manager of one of his massage parlors and gave him an offer he couldn't refuse. 33-year-old Yoshifumi Kubota had been down on his luck for quite some time, so when Kazuhito offered him over $175,000 for a job, he just about jumped at the chance. But there was a catch. To earn the money, Yoshi would have to commit murder, and his target would be none other than Shiori Ino. Finally, on October 26th of 1999, as Shiori cycled to Okigawa Station, Yoshi was waiting for her. As she reached the station and climbed off her bike, Yoshi approached her from behind and stabbed Shiori in the side of the torso. She screamed out in pain, but as she turned and attempted to flee the scene, Yoshi plunged the blade into her heart, killing her instantly. She was officially pronounced dead at 12:50 p.m., with her cause of death listed as shock due to massive bleeding. Immediately, the Saitama police realized what a terrible mistake they'd made. Every word of Shiori's story had been true. She was an innocent victim, not a criminal accomplice. Yet instead of apologizing, reviewing the incident, or changing their procedure, they did something unforgivable. They began what amounted to a campaign of disinformation, falsely portraying Shiori as a promiscuous harlot who'd manipulated Katsuhito into buying her a variety of designer goods. This was jumped on by the nation's tabloid newspapers, who began pumping out completely fallacious stories on how Shiori was an escort, a con artist, and a criminal. It was victim blaming of the highest degree, and if it wasn't for the noble work of journalist Kiyoshi Shimizu, the truth might have been buried forever. Kiyoshi began digging for the facts, interviewing Shiori's parents, as well as a variety of her close friends. He also began investigating Katsuhito and discovered that Shiori wasn't the only girl he had lied to regarding his age and occupation. Kiyoshi produced an extensive write-up, with a magazine by the name of Focus publishing it during the fall of '99. It was truly a brilliant piece of investigative journalism, one which vindicated Shiori and her grieving family. The evidence was so cohesive and compelling that it whipped up outrage among the Japanese public, forcing the police to arrest Katsuhito's handful of accomplices. It should be noted that he had completely absconded following the murder, and that Kiyoshi Shimizu actually tracked him down personally before forwarding his location to the police. Katsuhito might have been pure evil, but he was no idiot, and he soon cottoned on to the fact that he was being followed. So, instead of surrendering himself or allowing himself to be captured, he made the decision to take his own life. His body was found on January 27th of the year 2000, floating in a lake near the town of Teshikaga. Police then found a letter in his hotel luggage, one which amounted to a note describing him taking his own life, explaining that he had planned to take his own life at some point following Shiori's murder. Public outrage also promoted a legislative hearing by the Saitama Prefecture Police, who were heavily criticized in the Japanese media for their apparent dereliction of duty. Yet this is the same media machine that pumped out smears against Shiori and had essentially defended an obsessive psychopath. The police issued a formal apology to the Ino family, and 9 Saitama police officers were either disciplined or outright fired for their colossal failures. Yoshifumi Kubota, Shiori's killer, was eventually given 18 years in prison, while other accomplices received 15 years. On the other hand, the hero journalist who'd uncovered the truth received the Editor's Choice Magazine Journalism Award, as well as the National Association of Commercial Broadcasters in Japan Reporting Award for his work. He would later receive the same awards again after clearing an innocent man's name, and was quick to point out similarities with how the police and prosecutors handled the case. After the scandal was put to bed, the Japanese government instituted a series of anti-stalking regulations, which they hope would make similar incidents a thing of the past. Yet it seems as frustrating as it is tragic that a young woman had to lose her life in order for such regulations to be put into place. Yet it's tough not to be reminded of an old adage, one that says, safety regulations are written in blood. It's just a shame that in this case, that blood had to be Shiori's. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, we're going to collab. We're going to start a band with Jodie Foster.